So as I said earlier, agoraphobia once was linked to panic disorder. And we believe that panic disorder was with or without agoraphobia. However, through research, we've come to realize that agoraphobia can occur with or without panic attacks, right? So it is possible to have agoraphobia stand alone. And as a function of that, the DSM-5 included agoraphobia as its own diagnosis. Now, I know I defined in the video on phobias what agoraphobia is, but I'll do so again. Agoraphobia is some level of fear when a person's put in a situation where they feel it's either impossible or cannot escape. So a person, if they feel that they're trapped, they're going to develop panic sensations. For example, if a person is in a very crowded theater, or they're at an airport, and or Times Square would be a good one, where there's so many people around them, it can create significant discomfort. Now, most people are somewhat annoyed when experiencing crowds, but we persist, right? In order to have agoraphobia, you have to have this distress in several locations or several situations. So a minimum of two. I talked to you about the possibility of it occurring during public transportation. So a person on a train having a fear that the train is going to break down and they're not going to be able to escape, right? That would be a situation. But that in isolation is not enough to diagnose an individual with agoraphobia. They have to have it in other circumstances as well. So we talk about things like bridges. We talk about malls, crowds, comedy shows, anywhere where the person feels that they cannot escape, and they become so paralyzed by this that many people with agoraphobia actually avoid leaving their home, or they avoid going to great distances. I have one client now who, I'll talk to you about being stuck in an elevator, because that might be something different depending on the circumstance.
Professor, sorry to interrupt. I just
Let me finish my story, and then I'll
What?
Who's the main character's name?
Adriana, your mic is live. So if you could all kindly mute your mic for the time being, that would be great. So I have a client now who has agoraphobia, and she will not drive on the highway because she's afraid of what would happen if there's a traffic jam and she has some kind of physical problem and nobody can get to her. So she won't drive on the highway, she won't drive over bridges, and so forth. So she's limited to, roughly a 5 to 10 minute radius from her home. And that causes her significant distress. So there's that fear or anxiety around not being able to get help or escape. And people with agoraphobia avoid that. And I said at its most extreme, people don't leave their house, because if they leave their house and they're unaccompanied and something happens to them, they might feel that it's dangerous. Similar to other phobias, the agoraphobia has to be for a minimum of 6 months or longer, and it has to cause some kind of distress. Now, Adriana, did you want something? Did you have something to say? I wasn't sure.
Professor, I just have a question.
Okay, sure.
So basically, agoraphobia is claustrophobia part of agoraphobia or
No.
not?
In fact, that was the chat, right? So Ing Wang suggested being stuck in an elevator. Now, if it is because you're stuck in an elevator and you cannot escape, and the fear is escaping or the lack thereof, maybe that scenario would be more linked to agoraphobia. But if it's very confined or restrained spaces in an elevator that people don't want to ride the elevator because there are just too many people and they feel suffocated, that would be called claustrophobia, and it can stand separate from agoraphobia. So they're not one in the same. I don't know if that
Okay.
answers your question.
Yeah. That answered my question. Thank you.
Got it. Now, Adriana, I want to go back to you because I want to make sure. Was there a question you had?
No, I didn't have a question. Sorry.
Okay, just checking because I didn't want to go on without covering it. All right. So agoraphobia is pretty pervasive. I have another client that I'm working with. She never leaves her house. And she requires people to pick up her medication for her. She requires a delivery service for all of her food. And it's because of the fear of something happening and her not being able to address it outside of the home. So this is a real condition, and it affects a significant number of people. When does this typically occur? It occurs usually in the 20s or 30s, but can occur across the lifespan. So how do we explain agoraphobia? The answer is simple. We explain it the same way we explain other specific phobias, right? So if you go back to the video on specific phobias and some of the behavioral explanations or the biological explanations, they're at play. Now, you might say, well, then why not leave agoraphobia in the general phobias category? Well, because agoraphobia is so significant and so extreme, it stood out for its own. Now, I did say you can have agoraphobia and be diagnosed with a panic disorder, right? They can be co-occurring. You can have agoraphobia by itself as well. So there is still some relationship between agoraphobia and a panic disorder, but because panic attacks are not required for the diagnosis, agoraphobia is its own disorder. Now, I'm saying this because as a clinician, in order to give an accurate diagnosis, we need to know the diagnostic differentials. We need to be able to know what are the features that would make a condition disorder X versus the features that would make a condition disorder Y. So we have to rule out conditions that have similarities. So now, because panic attacks are not required for agoraphobia, if a person has recurring panic attacks, they could get diagnosed with a panic disorder in addition. Okay, so how do we treat it? From a behavioral point of view, we're going to treat it with exposure therapy. What usually works when we're dealing with agoraphobia is something called systematic desensitization, which is a gradual, slow process where we expose the individual to whatever is triggering the agoraphobia gradually, slowly, and with more intensity, right? Until they become desensitized to whatever it was. So one of the exercises I'm working with the client who feels they can't drive on the highway is to have someone sitting with them in the car and drive 5 minutes. And then we do that for a while. And then as they got used to it, I extended it, drive 10 minutes and then drive 15 minutes to the point where they're becoming more comfortable going on the highway. I have not removed the other person from the car yet, so we're still in process of this exposure, but eventually the exercise or the assignment will be to go drive on the highway without that person in the passenger seat. We also have support groups. Support groups are not the same as group therapy, right? These are other individuals who are struggling with agoraphobia, and they might talk about what works for them, right? Because clinicians do not have a monopoly on truth or strategies. Support groups can be helpful as well. And then we have home-based self-help. I continue to go back and forth with the client that is homebound whether we should be doing home-based therapy, where I bring the exposure therapy to them. Usually we do therapy in the office or virtual therapy, but sometimes if a person is so confined, you might have to bring the therapy to them. And that's a form of home-based intervention. So that's our agoraphobia. And that is the end of the traditional anxiety disorders. I said to you that in the DSM-5, there was a separation between the traditional anxiety disorders, obsessive compulsive related disorders, and stress related disorders. So I'm going to stop here and then we'll talk about OCD on its own.